Welcome to the Glad You Knew Politics podcast. I'm Rhys and here with me is Nathan Ang. Today, we will be discussing Black Lives Matter and everything that comes with it.
Our special guest expert this episode is Davin Phoenix. He is a professor at the University of California, Irvine, where I had the pleasure to sit and learn in his class on race and politics that was as eye-opening as the chat we have today. As Davin pointed out in today's podcast, he is an expert voice on this issue not simply because of the color of his skin, but because it is something he has thoroughly researched and studied. Davin's book, The Younger Gap: How Race Shapes Emotion in Politics, has recently been published and has been considered such essential reading during this wave of protests against racial injustice that it was temporarily made free to read by the Cambridge University Press. It is a book I highly recommend that you go out and buy before they sell out. I know Rhys has bought a few copies for Christmas.
I don't think they are selling out, Nathan, but it's a ripper read, and you'll be glad you knew more about race and politics. Before we get stuck in, something to keep in mind is that the way healthcare works in America is different to Australia. In Australia, there is universal health coverage from the government, while in America, each person has to get their own private health insurance coverage, which means that some people can't afford it or can't afford to have good coverage. And another thing is the difference in police departments. America's divided up into 50 states, and each state has its own police force. Within each state, there are multiple counties. Each county has a sheriff's department. Within each county, there are multiple cities, and each city has its own police department. This means that there are thousands of police departments that each get their own funding and has its own rules and regulations. As we are a podcast that prides itself on speaking up on issues that matter not only to me and you, but also to everyone else in the community. Today's episode really struck a chord as it made us realize there's more than meets the eye when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. We all had the ability and the responsibility to make a difference, and it begins by having a richer understanding of race and racism. So, let's get into it with this week's guest expert, Davin Phoenix. What inspired you to study research and eventually write a book on race, emotion, and politics?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I can't say there's any kind of specific moment where the kind of clouds opened up and the light shone on me and I said, this is my project, this is my focus. I think it was just kind of a lot of experiences I had picked up on over time, thinking about what it meant to be in America in this skin, what it meant to be a military brat in the skin, living on these military bases with people from different parts of the country and different countries, and kind of have a lot of the people across communities and across races kind of have a certain set of expectations about me before knowing me based on my race, and thinking about what that meant, not really having the kind of language to think through. Like, why do people think they know who I am or who I ought to be or what I ought to be because of what they can see? And so just as I started to kind of pay more and more attention to the news, and then maybe reached a point where I started paying too much attention to the news, right? I thought about how politics was something that I wasn't just interested in, but seemed to be something that was very important. I think that kind of planted the seeds when I thought about what role I might have in my life as an adult. I was like, maybe I can go into politics. And then as I kind of went through college, I thought, I don't want to be kind of acting in the world of politics or participating directly in politics, but I'm still curious about it and kind of the effect it has on people. So maybe I can do something else. And I started thinking about the idea with some faculty to give me that push to just like make a career out of studying politics. My entryway was in thinking about how the kind of media that we consume can really shape our expectations of ourselves and others, and how that can have a political importance to it. And then when I was in my graduate studies at the University of Michigan, I became really interested in the work within political psychology on emotions, and how these different emotions, these different feelings that we can express, maybe feelings that we don't even know how to express, can really shape how we participate or how we make decisions around politics, around our preferences, in really systematic ways without us even knowing them. And I thought that could probably really be something I could sink my teeth into, especially in thinking about how there's not enough work I was seeing that thought about the way in which our race interacts with those emotions. Because I think some groups, and we can talk about this when we think about the kind of current state of protest, some groups carry some potential consequences or some costs for making expressions of emotions like anger that we don't necessarily see other groups, at least in the US, face. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing to explore. Like, what are the consequences of that? If not every group can kind of get angry the same way, can every group then not utilize anger to affect change in the same way?
So before we talk about other races, I think the main talking point would be the Black Lives Matter protests. And, we've seen a lot of mixed messaging about it and what they're for. And some people are not necessarily supporting the movement, but are supporting in terms of ending racism. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you think about the Black Lives Matter movement?
So we can think about how the Black Lives Matter movement is kind of this distinct collective. It's kind of loosely organized around some core ideas and kind of policy prescriptions. We can also think about how it's kind of connected to a really bigger history of Black-led movements in the US. And so you think of the origins of the specific group, right? It's 3 Black women that came together that had different experiences and histories of organizing around different issues. And after, a young Black man, Trayvon Martin, really boy, like a 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida in a suburb by George Zimmerman, who was kind of self-appointing himself as a neighborhood watchman. And there was a sea of unrest and uproar and anger about this encounter that led to the death of the 17-year-old boy. These 3 women came together and said, Black Lives Matter. This is something that doesn't seem to be apparent in our criminal justice system. It doesn't seem to be apparent in how media covers instances in which Black people, particularly young Black people, are kind of criminalized, not given the benefit of the doubt, kind of seen as threats, and rather than as kids. And so they kind of collectively came together under that name, Black Lives Matter. And I think the organization or the movement really kind of exploded onto the scene after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014 by the white police officer, Darren Wilson. And so many people took to the streets in anger and in protest, and many of them rallied around that call, Black Lives Matter, whether or not they knew the source or the origin of that term or not, right? That really became this kind of galvanizing call. But so the people that originated Black Lives Matter kind of laid out, right, kind of the things that they see as wrong that need to be right. And they say that these things can't just be righted with a simple law change or kind of reform or different kinds of policies, right? They're asking for some more transformational change. And so they look at, instances of violence by police against Black individuals, as not just isolated incidents, right? But this kind of long running pattern throughout US history, long before they adopted the kind of term Black Lives Matter. And they say we can't think about that type of racial violence without thinking about economic disparities and health disparities and disparities in the legal justice system. We have to think about all these together. So the movement itself, when you kind of dig a little deep and look at what they're advocating for, is about much more than just kind of the criminal justice system and the need for reform or transformation. It's all about a lot of things related to class and the intersection of race and class, the intersection of race with sexuality and gender, and kind of advocating for Black trans people, Black gay and lesbian people are more likely to be homeless as youth, more likely to be targeted by violence in different ways. And so it's a really far-reaching thing that's trying to connect all of these different isms and disparities and say, we need to gather people together to spark a revolutionary change to address all of these together. Because they say, you can't address one sufficiently without addressing the other connected issues, class, sexuality, race. So,
Evan, what is your dream that you see the protests achieve in your lifetime?
Wow, that's a really difficult question in my lifetime, because one of the things that we see from protests is that, you see kind of the push by the protests, and then you see the pushback, right? And then you see the reorganizing and kind of response, and the response, right? The backlash, the backlash, the backlash. So it's tough to say. There's a lot that we're seeing right now that isn't necessarily related to the core issues of kind of transforming our system of policing and our criminal justice system, but you can't kind of dismiss all the radical changes, not radical, at least symbolic changes that we're seeing, from Confederate monuments being torn down and toppled to the Confederate flags being removed from state houses across the US, to kind of racially insensitive or racist names of products and brands being changed, more opportunities given to Black storytellers within the worlds of media, So, I mean, those things do matter, right? Because those symbols can be impactful. But what I do actually hope to see in my lifetime are genuine reimaginings of how policing works at the local level, and a significant shift of money away from law enforcement and criminal justice and towards health services, towards pre-K and K through 12 education, towards social work and people that can be first responders that aren't armed officers but can de-escalate situations and alleviate, provide care for children. That's a huge thing. Like childcare, right? We talk about these issues, they're often not talked about in racial terms, but I think as the toll of COVID has shown us in the US, right? Like all of these things have a clear racial element, whether you're talking about people having job stability, people having good access to quality foods, people having access to quality healthcare and the insurance to pay for that healthcare when they're in need of it. The ability to, it's the ability to like go to college, right? And afford college and be able to kind of get a return on your investment for the education and not kind of be consumed by debt for the rest of your adult life, right? All of these are core issues that a lot of people can kind of see the importance of. And I think when you look at the numbers across race, right? Like Black and Latinx folks are often, or pretty much always, disproportionately affected by those things, disproportionately lack that kind of access. So I'd love to see, at least in the context of this pandemic that the US continues to struggle with, right? A solid defense of healthcare resources and kind of expanding access to healthcare and expanding access to childcare, because I think that's been a critical thing that we're seeing as the economy kind of screeched to a halt. And there's all these plans to reopen, but we don't have a quality plan to reopen schools. When we do reopen those schools, can we shift some of those resources that the teachers can have more, that the books can be updated, and we don't have these police officers patrolling school halls as though they're prison grounds.
As you've explained there, like how you want the money to be redirected away from law enforcement and the police and into other avenues to help. Would you say that the long form explanation that you've just given is really how they've tried to shorten it and made it kind of a buzzword to say defund the police, where people go, oh, that sounds like a very radical idea, and it's much tougher to say what you've just said and put it into a tweet or an Instagram post and go, this is what we want.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these movements can certainly be broken down, right? Distilled into like phrases, right? What doesn't just fit in a tweet? What can be repeated in a hashtag, right? So we think about all of the issues that are captured in the 3 words Black Lives Matter, right? I think we see something very similar with Defund the Police. And, it sounds radical until you look at budgets across the years and you see that pretty steadily since the Reagan era in 1980, we've seen budgets for so many critical public services slashed. And the one budget that has been slashed that keeps going up is policing, right? And so oftentimes people are talking about defund the police. A lot of people mean a lot of different things when they say that, right? But for people that see that and are like, whoa, so you're saying we're not going to have police anymore? They're saying, well, hold on. In this constant era of belt tightening, maybe we can take this money that's kind of going to police using, high grade military Call of Duty level equipment, right? And say, let's give that to some of these other public services that have just been struggling. And let's actually think about the ways in which the money that is going to some of these public services is actually going to police. I know it's been a big deal in LA where they're like, oh, we cut so much funding from police, but they're kind of rerouting it. So the money's still going to police, but like through education budget and stuff like that. People are like, no. We don't want funny math, right? We don't want like accounting tricks. We want to see the services that help people to lead healthy, productive lives get replenished. And you do that, you don't need as intensive a focus on policing and law enforcement because you've given people a chance to not need to rely so much on extra legal means, hustling and getting the bills paid or getting a roof over their head. That's another big thing too. We need more housing money because housing is a huge mess in the US.
So, Davin, why does the police get so much funding?
Yeah, that's a nice question. So there's a couple of things we can think about. One is, to kind of, break it down a little bit without getting too jargony or too technical, right? I know when I was a kid, I was not very different from many other kids growing up, where you can name maybe like 4 total jobs as a kid, right? Teacher, doctor, police officer, fireman, right? Firefighter. And maybe you can name one more, like lawyer or something.
Or
right?
a professor like yourself.
I wouldn't even name professor, right? I would have named teacher, but not even college professor, right? That was too far beyond my imagination. And so I think we have this very reverential place for police officers in just our culture, right? And so you think about like what plays on US television screens every night. It's like half cop shows, right? If you think about how long Law and Order and all the spinoffs have been, not only on television, but really redefining how people think about crime and the legal system in the US. They did a study that showed like people's ideas about New York City changed as Law and Order, the original Law and Order, became more popular, because people thought throughout the 70s and 80s, New York was just this den of fear and, you know, criminals gone wild. And Law and Order gave them a sense that, no, there is law and order in this city. And every crime that happens for a reason, right? It's always like someone that was wronged or something. So that actually shaped people's impressions of New York and made them more willing to go visit the city, right? So these impressions really do matter a great deal. And so when you're talking about challenging police, you're running up against an entire kind of nation of people that have been socialized to think of police as unequivocally the good guys. And one of the core reasons the US is what it is. So that's a key reason, right, that we have seen police budgets remain growing in the face of all these other budget cuts. Another reason is that police unions are incredibly strong and powerful and influential, right? And so at a local level, if you are, you know, a city council or even a state assembly considering budget cuts, you're going to hear from that police union, right? And they're going to say, look, we're going to be campaigning against you. We're going to be withholding our funds from you. And that's really critical, right? So they have a great deal of influence over the lawmakers that kind of, you know, oversee those budgets. And then finally, it is very easy and effective to mobilize people on the basis of appeals to getting tough on crime, right? And so you can activate people's fear of criminality, fears that are often tied to people's stereotypical beliefs about racial minorities, and you can get people mobilized to support you and vote for you. So it's a really critical kind of political wedge issue as well. And so I think those three reasons that layer on top of each other to keep these budgets kind of really robust.
So would it help if people had more support from the government so they weren't relying on protection from police forces?
It's a really fascinating question to consider, the variations, right, in which communities view police with trust and reverence, in which communities view them with suspicion and see them as the last resort, right? There are many communities that say, well, regardless of what kind of trouble we find ourselves into, we don't feel comfortable calling police because we believe they view us as a threat and not the people in need of serving and protecting. So I think that's a really loaded question for some people, right? Like, who are you going to call if we defund the police? So like, we haven't been calling the police, right? And so to speak more directly to your question, you know, I fall in line with people that think, you know, if we want to shift opinion on something, it's okay for the political leadership to kind of take that first step out there. And people might say this is too radical, but they ultimately fall in line, you know, especially if they can see the benefit to them. So we can consider like how radical, at least in the kind of public debates, you know, the Affordable Care Act was, aka Obamacare. And there were a lot of people that were lining up to repeal Obamacare. There's still many people lining up to repeal Obamacare, but, you know, the 11 years in, maybe a good 9 years after it was implemented, many of those people that initially were saying this is too much, too fast, too soon, they're like, you touch my Obamacare and I'm going to have a problem, right? Because they came around. Why is that? Because they saw it worked better enough for them than they thought it would. And so I think that's really important for us to understand when we consider these issues or questions that might be too radical to be on the pale. If we had political leaders that were willing to step out and take that step and get the pushback for it, we would ultimately find probably that public opinion would kind of shift to fall in line with it. People are going to still remain completely opposed to it. But I think there's a lot of middle ground there, people that would be opposed to it now that if they saw it in action would be like, oh, this isn't dramatically different than what I was expecting, and maybe I can see some benefit from it.
Being tough on crime, I think when you learn more and study more about what this phrase really means, you can see how people can really believe in it, because it's a logical, it speaks to the imagination of how logical it is. Like, there is crime, you want to be tough on it, because if you're not tough on crime, you're a softie, you're letting all the rapists and the murderers get out. But, you know, when we think of criminals, we don't think of this guy just stole $10 from the store, or he or she just shoplifted the store. It's always the worst case possible. They raped 10 people and they killed the whole town, and those are the criminals we think about. What would you say to when we see racial minorities? Usually they get stereotyped in terms of the criminal element. How do we go about changing those perceptions that racial minorities are not inherently these terrible people that you see on the streets that you got to be afraid?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly tough because you're talking about kind of a narrative that is kind of accessible, a narrative that's kind of linking racial minorities to criminality of different types that's kind of almost inescapable, right? So it's like, well, if our political leaders stop trafficking in those stereotypes, we'd see progress. But then also, like, news, particularly local news, is overrepresenting people of color as perpetrators of crime in their news reports. And they're often leading their local news broadcasts with those sensationalized crime stories, which do two things, as you've seen from a lot of work in this area. It's made people that watch local news regularly greatly overestimate how much violent crime is happening in their communities. And it makes them much more likely to assume that suspects or perpetrators of crimes are people of color, typically Black or Latino, depending on what part of the country they're in, right? So that's really tough, right? It's not just news media, it's popular media as well. We're still often seeing people of color, and we can broaden this out, right? Black, Latinx, East Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Arab American, North African. We're still seeing those folks overrepresented as criminals or bad guys, whether they're, the kind of criminal mastermind, the terrorist threat, or like the, thug dealer, something or other. So it's all kind of, really, really ingrained in kind of, the images that we produce. So we're really talking about systematically changing our standards for public officials, but also changing our standards for media, news media outlets, and changing our standards for popular media outlets.
So when you talk about systematic changes and how it's a systematic problem, would you be able to explain that in a simple manner of what does that exactly mean? Because when people talk about Black Lives Matter and police brutality, some people just go, but what about black on black crime? These guys are criminals and they deserve to be treated that way by the police.
So it's really important for us to have a breakdown of what we talk about, right, when we mean systematic, because very often we think about the ways in which racism and prejudice are talked about. We're talking about it at a very individual level, right? This person discriminated against this person. This person unfairly called the cops on this group or this individual. And so we think, well, if we can just root out those bad apples, right, we'll solve the problem. But systemic racism is what happens when you have people that themselves aren't racist or prejudicial carrying out the laws, carrying out the policies, and we're seeing the impacts of those laws and policies continue to have these different effects on different groups. So connect to the earlier conversation that we were just having, that thread. For all the talk about violent crime and being tough on crime and needing to have police, like violent crime rates have gone down incredibly and consistently and steadily in the past, it's already 2020, the past, 30 years. Right? If you look at the graph, they were pretty high in 70s and they've just cratered, right? And yet we still have this resonant conversation about crime. And when you talk about crime, people think about rapists and murderers. But the vast majority of people that are in jail for nonviolent offenses, right? Predominantly marijuana use, which is steadily becoming decriminalized. And so systematic racism is evident in making people think that we need more money for prisons than schools, and the US being the number one incarcerator in the world, at the same time that violent crime has gone down, and Black people taking marijuana, using marijuana prior to it being decriminalized in a lot of states at rates the same as whites or slightly lower than whites, and being 3 times more likely to be arrested and be in jail for it. And systematic racism is also present in the fact that in states that were the first to legalize marijuana, Washington, I forget the other one, but I looked at the data in those 2 states, right? The arrest rate for the states where it's still illegal, 3 to 1. Every white person that's arrested, 3 Black people arrested. And the arrest rate after it was legalized in Washington was 2.8 to 1, right? So the arrest rate didn't go down at all. So even when we're talking about let's change the law so that the people that are disproportionately affected won't be affected anymore, they've still managed to find ways to arrest Black people at 3 times the rate of white people. And so why is that, right? Because it wasn't just about the law. It was about racial segregation, right? Black people, white people are living in completely different neighborhoods from one another. And that hasn't been rectified from the point of time in which people were starting to buy houses in the US, which was around the post-war period, 40s and 50s. So you still have very different neighborhood composition. And that means you can have very different patterns of policing. You can have Black neighborhoods that have many more patrols of police going through them than white neighborhoods. And on top of that, you can have people that are walking through the street that look like a suspect to those police because of the color of their skin, right? So just in thinking about marijuana decriminalization, we've named like 3 different things that are going on, and none of which can be solved by simply saying, oh, well, let's just replace the prejudiced people with non-prejudiced people, right? Because that does nothing for the Black people that generations ago couldn't get a home loan from the federal government. So instead of living in the neighborhood they would have liked to have lived in, they've been in this neighborhood that's been bereft of resources. And then it's not, is it prejudice that makes people not want to, start the firm or open up the nice new complex or job creating little thing in this neighborhood that doesn't have many resources? You say, well, that's just capitalism. Well, then let's layer that into the problem too, right? So if capitalism is going to justify like, well, let's not invest in the Black neighborhoods, then we have to take a serious look at capitalism, right? Because if we're talking about the goal being erasing these racial inequities, you have to see how they all layer on top of each other. And the only way to alleviate those is to actually make some really difficult decisions that require sacrifice. Because when we're talking about disparities, it's easy to focus on what Black people don't have access to. But it's very often zero sum in that they don't have access to this thing equally because white people in neighboring neighborhoods have more access to them, right? So you can't just say, and let's close it, you can't just say like, well, we need to improve the schools for Black people, for Black students, right? Because they're more often than not kind of in schools that are like 80% Black, and those schools don't have the same resources as the nearby white schools. So what are you going to do? You're going to integrate the schools? Are you going to take resources from the richer white schools and give them to the Black schools? You know who's opposed to that? The white parents in those neighborhoods, right? They show up in droves in those school board meetings, those city council meetings. No, right? So that kind of sacrifice and the unwillingness to make that sacrifice, I'm not saying that makes someone individually prejudiced or discriminatory, right? But by looking to uphold their status and being protective of that status, right, that can reinforce the ultimately racist outcome. And that's how the system works, because good people can be complicit in that system, even if they don't want to be discriminatory, but they want to preserve that system.
So what role does race play in all of this? Should white people speak about this issue?
I think everyone has to interrogate themselves, right? So first on the question of like, should I use my voice if I'm not a member of this group? Should I speak on this? What should I do? And I think anyone that feels that they are a just person that believes in racial justice, that believes in racial equity and fairness, if those are core principles for you, then I think you might feel compelled to speak up and to speak out. And if you don't feel compelled to speak up and speak out, maybe those core values aren't as important to you as you claim, right? So I'm not going to tell anyone what they should or should not do, but I will say, if this is something that you define yourself by, then maybe that necessitates that you speak up and speak out. And so the question then becomes, well, what can I say? What can I do? We don't want just anybody saying anything, obviously. So, we all have to recognize that we have to do a lot of learning too. And so I don't speak on these things simply because I'm Black. I don't think that because I'm Black, I have an authority on these, right? I'm comfortable speaking about these things because I feel like I've done a lot of learning and continue to learn. And some of the learning has been experiential for sure, just kind of being Black in America. But a lot of that learning has come from opening myself up to critical ideas and smart people and pushing myself and challenging myself when things kind of disrupt my comfort zone. So I think that's an important thing. Are you willing to learn? Are you willing to kind of take a beat and consume new perspectives and ideas and information? And when that information gets a little too close to home, are you willing to keep powering through and kind of deal with that? And then once you feel like you have that base of knowledge, there's still the challenge of, now when I speak on it, I know there's going to be people that are on board with this, but there are going to be people, including people that I might know and love intimately, that are completely resistant to it and think, oh, you turncoat, right? Like you're just, one of those woke libs now, right? Whatever the language is, right? Are you willing to then have difficult conversations with them and confrontational conversations with them? And once you let them know why you feel compelled to speak out and to be an advocate for racial justice and for people that are subjugated and why they should maybe check themselves, consider the ways in which they have active or passive roles in helping keep those communities subjugated.
Do schools do enough at a younger level about educating about racial injustice?
Absolutely not. I say that as a product of the U.S. public K-12 system. Many of these schools taught on military basis. It's just like an abjectly terrible job of teaching kids about race, about just history, just about history. I remember, I just had this conversation on Twitter where we had a module in elementary school on ancient Egypt, right? And the grand, wondrous Egyptian civilization and all the contributions to society, from the architecture, right, to the customs, the religion, the language. And never at one point in that module did they teach us that Egypt was in Africa. I found out like a year later. I just happened to be looking at the map because, classrooms always have maps and globes, right? I think I had some free time. I was looking at the globe and I was kind of spinning around. And I was shocked to see that Egypt was in Africa. And I was like, that never came up, right? So like, even when we're learning history, often it's like completely divorced from race. And so that's kind of a global example, right? But when I think about what I learned about US history, we were often kind of given this impression that change that happened in the US, whether it's the end of slavery or the granting of the right to vote to women and to racial minorities, to kind of ending Jim Crow segregation throughout the South and the informal practices throughout the North as well. We kind of get this impression that it was because the white folks in power just kind of evolved and became enlightened. We don't learn about the struggles that created and precipitated that change, and the way in which anything that has been won in America for any particular group has been won on the basis of some type of warfare, whether it's explicit warfare or like, verbal warfare, cultural wars, political warfare. And I think that's really important that we don't understand that, because I think we just think when we see these problems, we're socialized to think, well, we'll figure it out because that's what America does, because we're so special. We're just better than everyone else. And we're just, stuff happens through effort and struggle and change. And I think even just having that understanding when we go through American history and not like brushing over the darker chapters in the history, but really dealing with them and thinking through how we learn them, it's really hard to imagine us being in this position that we're in, having the leadership that we have that is just bereft of any capability of leading the country, particularly in the midst of a pandemic. Like, the Donald Trump regime is literally populated by people who espouse and hold white supremacist views, right? And are looking to, including with elements today, ensure that people of color are not an increasing influence in this country, right? They work to make life more difficult for people of color within the US. They work to make it arbitrarily more difficult for people of color to enter the US or to reside in the US. Like, these are not incidental or accidental practices, right? And we have people that we can look to, like Stephen Miller, particularly, right? Who's only grown in his influence in the Trump cabinet, right? This is someone that has a record of believing in white supremacist views. And the American the general response is, oh, well, let's just try to vote him out in 4 years, right? Like, I think we get to this point in this country when we have no fundamental understanding of what change actually looks like. And we think, oh, we'll just figure it out because we always have. And we just dismiss that it wasn't about figuring it out. It was about fighting these battles and fighting and fighting and fighting.
Would you say these protests are essentially a kind of war in a way, because it's about cost, really? Because we see in the media there's always a trope. The trope is about they shouldn't be rioting and looting because that's not the right way to go about a protest. And we see that in the way of how history remembers Martin Luther King. We just remember him, I think, in America now that, both sides of the political aisle believe that, he was such a great guy. He did it the right way. The protest movement was peaceful and things like that. But I think we forget nobody really liked him. He was a bit of a scoundrel back then. We learn in Australia as well about history, about Indigenous Australians were, they were kidnapped from their homes. They were literally taken from their homes. And that's the problem with history, where they go, this happened, but they don't go forward and say, but what's happening now? How is it affecting us now? And what's the outcome of it today?
Absolutely. And so when we think about these protests that are still very active and strong in so many major parts of the country, even if the news media has kind of turned its attention elsewhere, and still kind of being encountered with excessive police responses. We can certainly see that as the latest ongoing battle, right? And I think it's important for us to understand that context, right? That the people that are agitating and protesting and demonstrating, regardless of how they go about it, they have always been ostracized and stigmatized and labeled as threats. And there's always been reasons to delegitimize them. So to speak to your point about Martin Luther King Jr., right? At one point in the kind of height of civil rights activism in the US, Martin Luther King Jr. was labeled the most dangerous man in America, according to polls, right? He was loathed and despised by your average American, according to public polling data that we had at the time. And so the fact that we can look at him now and say, oh, he did it the right way, shows how hypocritical, right, our read of history can be and how that history can be self-serving. We can say, oh, well, we think that they're protesting for good reasons, but it's delegitimized because we see looting and we see violence. And it's like, well, when Colin Kaepernick did one of the most passive and quiet forms of protest imaginable, simply taking a knee during a song before a football game, right? People said, you can't go about it this way. It's completely disrespectful. It's like, you can't get more peaceful, quiet, and kind of, within yourself than that. It's not showy. It's not expressive. While everyone's standing, you're literally, reducing yourself. And you see the consequences of that. We're still hashing out how this was just incredible to do years later. And by the way, he still doesn't have a team, right, in the league, right? So I think it speaks to the kind of the ways in which, to use the football analogy, right, the goalpost continues to get moved. It's like, well, you do it peaceful, but it's not the right time. You do it and there's not peace. It's like, well, then you're delegitimized.
Can you tell us about the symbolism of the kneel
Sure.
for our Australian listeners?
Yeah. So I think 2015, 2016, Colin Kaepernick, and then the starting quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, someone who led them to their first Super Bowl in over a decade. He decided to take a symbolic stand against continued oppression of Black people in the country by saying, this national anthem, for me, doesn't represent what it represents for many other Americans. For me, I see it as kind of a slap in the face because the country has failed to live up to the ideals that are captured in this anthem. And on top of that, this anthem was written by someone that had very strong anti-Black views. And so he decided he would start kneeling during the anthem as a quiet, silent form of protest. Interestingly enough, right, he did it beginning the preseason of that football season. And it was one or two games that he kneeled before anyone actually took note of it. And that's how quiet and passive it is, right? But once people took note of it and asked him and explained why he wanted to kneel, why he was doing this, and some other players on his team and from across the league joined him, just a handful of players, it became kind of a media firestorm. And many people were up in arms saying that he disrespected the flag, disrespected the troops. And so that's a very fraught conversation because his intent was not to draw any attention to the anthem. His intent was to draw attention to the ways in which Black people are continually denied opportunities and brutalized within the U.S. And so to talk about disrespecting the flag when he was exercising many of the rights guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence, right, struck people as very contradictory and very indicative of how people, particularly people of color in the U.S., can't make expressions about the improvements they want to see without getting huge pushback. And so Colin Kaepernick, once his contract was up with the Niners or once they waived him, hasn't taken another snap for an NFL team since then. It's been a few years running now, despite having one of the more decorated careers of his peers. And so we see kind of the consequences of this athlete using his platform to take a very subtle and symbolic stand against injustice.
What I found really interesting is that before he took a knee, he was actually sitting down. I think is that the larger point that's not often talked about is that he actually sat down during the anthem as a protest. But now they try to distract the issue in terms of you're disrespecting the flag and our country and our national anthem. He actually consulted with someone in the military to say, how can I do it better without, let's say, disrespecting the flag? And that's how he went from sitting down to kneeling. But nobody likes a protest, really, even on a regular day. If it's not during a pandemic, what are your thoughts about protesting during a pandemic? Because especially here in Australia, when they were organizing the Black Lives Matter protests, they said, we shouldn't do it. The Prime Minister said we shouldn't do it because it's a health issue. but I see some merit in that because of, COVID-19, it's such a spreadable disease. But even during a normal time, like Colin Kaepernick's case, when there was it was the most passive protest in the world, he even received backlash for that. And there was also other protests like environmental protests where they chain themselves to a tree or a van and disrupt a road or something. It's never good. It's, you're disrupting people's lives. People are just going about their business. But in the end, nobody really likes a protest.
And didn't the Economist back that up as well?
Yeah, The Economist recently said, and they did a study and said that the protests actually didn't lead to an increase in COVID-19 cases because I think more people stayed home.
Yeah, so I think there's certainly a lot going on there. So I've seen similar reports, right, that in cities with the most kind of intensive protest activity, COVID rates did not increase. And I think it's not just a matter of people staying home, but I think there's a lot of people that had been very careful about following shelter-in-place orders and employing social distancing. And so the first time they were in crowds in months was to take to the street and protest. And because of that, I think they were especially careful. I was a part of a local protest here, and I know many of us were incredibly careful about trying as best we could to keep our distance and wearing masks and having full gloves and coverings. And so I think that's important for us to push back against, right? That the evidence shows that protesting has not led to increases. And I think it's rich to have that argument within the US when most of the states didn't even want to shut down, right? And kind of started reopening the country far too early, right? So it's like, you can't talk credibly about protesting is dangerous when you were like the last state to like shut down bars and pools and stuff, right? And you're like politicizing mask wearing, right? So yeah, again, we can think about the hypocrisies embedded within these anti-protest arguments, but I think it is really important for us to consider the fact that these protests that are continuing to be strong throughout the country are predominantly focused on kind of trying to identify and root out anti-Black racism within these U.S. structures. And at the same time, we're seeing that Black and Latino Americans are 3 times higher than white Americans to be contracting COVID, and that their mortality rates are much higher, right? So we don't need to like look at those as separate from one another. COVID is laying bare the racial disparities that people are protesting against. And I think this pandemic and people of color seeing that it was themselves and their loved ones that had to continue working because they're in essential jobs and service work there. So that makes them disproportionately likely to contract the disease. Seeing that the lower quality access to healthcare has even more pronounced impacts. Seeing that they live in food deserts, so they don't have as easy access to food. And so it's not as easy as, I can just have, Whole Foods delivered to my door. Like, that's not an option for me. I still have to make this 25-minute commute to this grocery store. And because it's the one grocery store for all of us, we're still going to be packed in that store, right? People seeing all the ways in which their everyday vulnerabilities, which might be more tethered to class than race, but are still present, how COVID made those all the more kind of risky and all the more potentially fatal. So I think that probably motivated a number of people to actually participate in these protests because they're in a moment in which they can't be distracted from, right, or can't deny the continued impact of these disparities on their day-to-day lives. Maybe in January, not as many people might have been motivated to take to the streets, but when this happens in March and April, and it's like we've been sitting for 3 months with the weight of these disparities, yeah, I'm willing to take to the streets. So I think that is really something that's important for us to consider, not just how the protests haven't raised COVID rates, but how COVID might be a significant, spark that helps to light this fire.
So speaking about protests, we've seen police brutality cases that have led to these protests, especially in the case of 2014 in Ferguson. George Floyd's death, how did it go from a nationwide protest to a global one?
So I wonder about what this moment that we're in as a world also does in contributing, right, to kind of creating these kinds of transnational senses of solidarity. It's kind of seeing people grapple with what this COVID pandemic has meant to our world. And one of the things that struck me from people that were trying to grapple with it was a sense that, well, for all of the struggles, there's something uniquely and profoundly uniting in that all around the world, we basically have to stay home, right? And kind of all around the world, regardless of time zone and language and customs, we're being encouraged to follow the same set of altered social practices. And I don't know what the medical physical bonds are, right, that can develop from that. But it does seem that just as George Floyd's death struck a particular chord with people in the midst of kind of staying at home and not having the typical distractions, it seems like that really was a similar situation throughout the world, right? Whereas you were speaking, right, you can see what's happening and connect it to the Aboriginal and Indigenous populations in Australia, right? Other people, everyone in the world has a population where they can say, if they're being honest, right, this group has borne the brunt of our society's unbalanced or antiquated laws and policies and practices. And if it takes this moment to make each of these groups visible in a way that we can't systematically or collectively like deny their experiences and deny the fact that they've been denied a fair shot, then, you know, maybe we will see something that's genuinely momentous and substantive from this moment.
So Corona, or should I say COVID-19, was a blessing in disguise almost for the movement.
Well,
In a very weird
I
way.
mean, for the movement, yeah, I think it has propelled the movement, right? I'll never call it a blessing, but I will say I think it is actually instrumental, right? Like, you know, one thing I try to do in my classes is think through, all right, we look at this moment in history, like for instance, like the civil rights movement or like the kind of era of 60s and 70s protests in the US. Like, why did this happen? No, seriously, like why? What was present in these years that wasn't present in other years, right? And so definitely when we look at this time, we have these things that are present now that simply haven't been present before. So it has to matter, right? Like we look at the counterfactual. These factors weren't there and we haven't seen this scope of action. And we have counterfactuals, right? George Floyd is killed in Minneapolis or Minnesota, sparking protests, sparking Minneapolis as an epicenter for protests. In 2016, Philando Castile is killed in Minneapolis, sparking protests. So very similar situations, same city. And what's the difference, right? So in the US context, the difference is the Trump era versus the Obama era and COVID versus not, no generation defining global pandemic that's disproportionately affecting people. These factors have to be mattering and why we're seeing this type of movement continue to kind of amplify when past movements from just 4 years ago didn't have the same reach.
When we talk about Philando Castile, he was a black man that was legally owning a firearm, and in terms of his background, he wasn't like a criminal or anything. But with George Floyd, there seems to be a focus on he had a criminal background or he was possibly using a forged check. Why is there always a focus on the criminality of him? When I think about it, even if he was using forged checks or something like that, it's not a crime that would ever result being choked to death or injury, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it connects to the earlier thread we were having about the kind of continued way in which Black and brown people can be linked to criminality, right? So even when you don't pose a threat, the association is so strong in the minds of people that want to make sense of this. And I want to also take a step back to say, people look at that footage and say, this doesn't make sense. Why would you literally squeeze the life out of this man? You hear him protesting, saying he can't breathe for minutes, and you just let those minutes pass by agonizingly so. Each one more breath coming out of his body until he has no more breaths to give. And people see that and they say, I don't know what country this is when that happens, when a police officer does that. And so they have to rationalize it. They have to justify it. There has to be something missing. So maybe he posed some kind of threat that wasn't represented in the video, but I don't know, is he some kind of criminal or something, right? So I think that is kind of reverse engineering a justification because it's really hard for a lot of people to sit with the idea that this is America. And many Black people in communities across the U.S. have been saying, not only is this America, this has always been America. So I think that's part of the motivation for us to always kind of look to the criminal records, not just the kind of long-running stereotype, but like if it really is as simple as this person posed no threat, then I have to kind of interrogate everything I know about this country, or at least everything I know about the police, everything I know about race in this country. And for a lot of people, they don't want to do that. So it's easier to say, well, he must have been some kind of threat somehow. We saw Trayvon Martin, right? Like Trayvon Martin's a 17-year-old kid that's walking back home after grabbing some Skittles from a convenience store. And people said, well, he looked threatening in a hoodie. Like a hoodie, seriously. Like what kid doesn't wear a hoodie, right? Like, and so we can think about the racial fraughtness of that, because I know that every kid that I went to school with had a hoodie, right? But apparently it's only the black kids that wear those hoodies that are dangerous. And then people said, oh, well, he smoked weed before, so could he have been some kind of threat? And again, I go back to those rates of marijuana use. They're equivalent. In fact, for people under the age of 18, white people smoke marijuana at a slightly higher rate than black people. And on top of that, when I look at any kind of coming of age film or TV show, it's Freaks and Geeks or whatever you want to input there, like there's always some like, oh, it's time for the kids to experiment with drug use, right? Like it's seen as a rite of passage for this group, and for this group, it's seen as a marker of death. To think about the $20, the counterfeit money, I saw a white man say, this is white privilege in a nutshell. I was arrested a couple years back for allegedly using a forged $20 bill to pay for something. And it's the story that I tell at dinner parties. George Floyd was arrested for the same, and he'll never come home to his family again. And so we have to always reckon with, right, grapple with that contradiction. Because if you don't grapple with that contradiction and you lean on, oh, well, somewhere down the line, he did something 12 years ago that makes this justified, right? We will continue to hold on to these myths, right, about America being something that it's not. And if you continue to hold on to the myth, then you will be opposed to the radical and necessary and needed change that so many people are pressing for right now. And then you're part of the problem.
It probably doesn't help with seeing Trump bragging on Twitter that he's the first ever president to act on police brutality. Is there any truth to this? And what I can't understand, that you just had Obama as president and being the first black president, why didn't he make this an issue of his tenure?
There's two responses to that. The first one is there's a long-running train of thought amongst my colleagues that politicians generally can't emphasize racial issues without being penalized. They can't emphasize their explicit support for specific policies to benefit Black people without being penalized. And that goes double if you yourself are Black. So for Barack Obama, himself being Black, everything he touches is already racialized. So he has to tread carefully. So there's a lot of work by people, including a good friend of mine, before Stevens, I'll give her a shout out, on how someone like Barack Obama is like the last person that can speak explicitly to kind of what he'll do for the Black community. We heard Obama say explicitly what he could do for the LGBTQ community. We heard him say explicitly what he could do for the Latinx community. We very rarely heard him say policy-wise what he would do for the Black community. And the understanding was because he's already kind of penalized for his race, he'll just be cratered, right, with prospective white voters. Now, and so we can problematize that. We can say, well, it's still worth it. Like the group still needs you to take that risk and act. But I will say, Barack Obama's Department of Justice did do a great deal of scrutiny of police departments that had racial issues. And he laid a lot of groundwork through the Department of Justice for reforms of police departments that had racial incidents. And one of the first things the Trump administration did upon taking office in 2017 was to erase all of those from the books. So when we talk about Trump saying he's done more for police brutality, not only is that a bald-faced lie, he actively and initially, right, one of the first things they did was to eradicate all of those reforms and all of that scrutiny and all of those demands for those of the police departments. So it's adding insult to injury when he speaks to that, right? Because not only has he not done what he claims to do, he, as in many cases, did the exact opposite of what he claimed to do.
As what have you made of the online activism and everyone posting on social media about the movement? Has it raised the awareness, or is this just virtual signaling?
Yeah, I think it can be both, right? I think people can make posts for clout and for woke points. And at the same time, I think it's undeniable that people posting can really shift the conversation and make issues that had never before been talking points. So to bring it back to the idea of defund the police, right? Now, there's a lot of nuance that's missing in that phrase. And there's lots of ways that phrase can be manipulated to serve purposes it's not intended to. There's a lot of ways people can say it just to get those points and just get that clout. But at the same time, regardless of all those reasons for putting in the conversation, there's no doubt it's in the conversation, I think, due in no small part to the proliferation of this idea in social media. So we have to be able to take the good with the bad.
What do you make of all these big corporations kind of jumping on the bandwagon? You know, on their social media profiles, they say we support these movements, but When you look at the actual practices, like the way they pay workers or exploit workers, it's not in line with the public persona.
Yes. So I think any corporation that is putting out a statement that isn't backing it up with some kind of significant slate of substantive actions, we can be very, skeptical or cynical about that, because these same corporations have a great deal of power to alleviate racial disparities. I know I was recently coming across some research that shows that firms say, right, like, we only benefit in terms of our bottom line when we make these kinds of statements, because they're not strong enough to alienate anyone that might be opposed, right, that might support racism. But they also don't hold us accountable to making any dramatic changes. People just feel good. They feel better about themselves for buying our product because they can kind of, convince themselves, oh, I'm supporting a good entity, a good corporation, a good firm.
What do you make of protests in other countries, Davin?
I think it really does signify just how far-reaching these issues of racism and kind of state-sanctioned violence are. They all have their distinct ways of manifesting and their distinct origins within a given context of a country, but the kind of core elements, I think, are the same, right? And so I think there's just been a reckoning. There's been people that just can't necessarily look away and can't say, oh, well, what's happening here is not what's happening there, and blah, blah. It's like, no, yeah, there's no denying it is, right? So the least we can do is make some kind of statement. So again, I think about what COVID has done in the inability to distract ourselves. Like, oh, racism's here, but oh, the next Avengers movie's coming. Like, no, we've had nothing, right? We've had no sports, no movies, right? We've had like our little things, like in the US, we were obsessed with Tiger King for like a full month, right? Which was just like ridiculous, over the top Southerners engaged in animal abuse, right? And we were obsessed with this for a month, which shows, right? We've just not had what we usually have. And so again, I think, not to, belabor that point, but I think that's really critically important, that we just have to kind of sit with this and say, my gosh, this is happening, and this kind of continues to happen, even if we might typically deny it.
In terms of making the argument for, Black Lives Matter and ending racism, I think that perhaps maybe in California or here in Melbourne, we live in kind of a very liberal state where people are left-leaning and they believe in these social values, and morally we can see why we fight for these issues. Is it a good idea to perhaps put forth another reason why they should support it, like perhaps an economic reason?
Sure. So I think I have two thoughts about that. And the first is, we can't even let off, kind of the more liberal, progressive areas off the hook, right? Because what I've seen is that the most kind of progressive or left-leaning communities have still mobilized against kind of the kinds of changes I was talking about. Like, when these very progressive communities have faced those options, they've said, no, 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 no. Right? Or like another huge one, right? These very liberal, progressive places being staunchly opposed to devoting resources to building affordable housing, right? Like, no, we don't want to live amongst these people, right? We love to say Black Lives Matter, but we don't want to actually live amongst people that are working class, Black folks, even folks of all races. So yeah, we still have a lot of ways to go with, like, the progressive folks putting the money where their mouth is. But in terms of the people that are in the conservative areas, the people that are in the more exclusively white areas, we've seen connections made. One of the things that I was surprised to learn in my readings about the Black Panther Party is their effectiveness at building coalitions with Appalachian poor whites throughout West Virginia. You had Panthers and Appalachian whites coming together. And so when we think about Appalachia, that's the mountainous region throughout the American Southeast, where you think of the kind of long history of generations of coal miners. You think about people that are working class or poor, rural, not just rural, country, white folks, right? We think the exact opposite of Black Panthers. And they were building a coalition. And what was that coalition built on the basis of? It wasn't the Panthers watering down their message at all, but it was saying, if we dismantle this racist capitalist system, we will not be the only ones to benefit. Here are the ways in which your communities, you might not be affected by race the way we are, but you're certainly affected by these exploitative labor practices, very similar to how you are. And the way in which they keep pitting you against us with the tough on crime narrative or the you're losing out narrative, the way they use that messaging to get you against us actually keeps you at their mercy. right? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to come together and we're going to advocate for this radical reorganizing of our economic sector, of our racial system, of our criminal justice system. And you're going to have a lot more than the crumbs you get from the scraps of the table, right? Maybe then we can hash it out between us, but we both are going to advance. So I think there's a way in which you can speak credibly to how, even if you benefit from your race from this system, there's so many ways in which you are hurt by this same system. And you might not see the benefits of dismantling the racism, but I tell you what, if we see that racism is connected to the other isms, particularly the class exploitation, then you're going to benefit from that as well. We really are not going to have the zero-sum competition, but we're going to have just a bigger pot to share from. I think that message, spoken in the right way from the right people, can resonate, and we can see some coalitions that we might not have expected across racial lines.
Just to wrap up for our last question is then, here in Australia, most of the major media, newspapers and TV shows and news shows are owned by a guy called Rupert Murdoch, which I think he owns Fox News in America. So you can imagine the kind of programming and news that we get on mainstream television. Like when people think of Fox News, they already know that, all right, it's not really news. I mean, it's news, but with this super right-wing racist slant. What would be the one thing that you would like people to know to help them better understand race and Black Lives Matter, and just to really improve the conversation and try to get people on side in a way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, there's so much you really raise a huge can of worms, right? In thinking about who controls major media outlets. And so the vast majority of media outlets are owned by, I think, like 6 companies, right? So we're still steadily seeing kind of consolidation, not just of popular entertainment, but of our news content as well. And so you're seeing just when we should, as we're continuing to get more diverse, have more diverse voices, we're seeing more of a consolidation, right, of perspectives in our news. And that's really unsettling. It's really scary. And so I think people have to be willing to could do a couple of things. Like, if you have the capacity, can you support independent media, right? Or even like for us, we have our public broadcast corporations. We have our media that has some funding that continues to get cut from government, but it's really focused on giving us independent, accessible, and information-led, not like controversy-led news and perspective and insight. And so I try to support them as best I can by tuning into them, participating in them, and contributing to them financially, right? And I also really try to, I know a lot of people say, well, you have to expose yourself to information from all sides and not just information that you agree with. And I buy into that 100%. But I also think it's fair for us to call out toxic, harmful media. There's plenty of media that's conservative that isn't trafficking in outright lies and propaganda. Fox News is dangerous and it's an anathema. And I would encourage anyone that wants to enhance the perspective to engage Fox News. There's plenty of conservative voices and perspective that aren't straight lying as agents of the state and creating harm. So I'd really want people to know that like consuming media doesn't just mean consuming anything and everything, right? It can be thoughtful and meaningful and just try and verify. Like I think social media is really important as a source of information that is critical, but isn't being prioritized by those giant firms and corporations. But it's really important, especially if you want to engage other people with what you've learned, to verify it. And it's not that hard. You just got to do a little bit of work, right? Wow, this news is shocking. I haven't seen anyone else talk about this. Is that because it's actually fake, right? Like someone else is going to be talking about it if it's newsworthy and noteworthy and if it's true. So just do that search. I know it takes extra work, but it's worth it. It really is worth it because you're going to find stuff that's important that you might not see covered, and you're going to make sure you're not fallible, right? That you're not falling for something by taking something and running with it, saying, oh, let me check this out. No, okay, this wasn't actually true. So yeah, just like it's really worth it. It's really worth it to put in that work to verify and just seek out different perspectives. But at the same time, know that there's things that are worth cutting off entirely.
I think when people see the news, they thrive on it being something. The news isn't telling us what is actually happening.
And so we have to be able to learn how to discern and be able to teach people, including our family members that might not be as discerning. Start locally, right? We don't have to all teach online courses, right? But there's plenty of people in our orbits that are vulnerable to that kind of fake news. And so how do we respectfully and lovingly, but forcefully say, this is not how you inform yourself, right? This might be more uncomfortable, but this is actually true, verifiable. And that's That's a battle that's larger than us, but at least we can kind of play our part in that.
Thank you for informing us and Australia, Davin. We really appreciate you being on the Glad You Knew podcast today and helping us understand the movement.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hope it was a productive conversation for everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Glad You Knew Politics podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating and a review on what you thought about this week's episode, and any other questions you might have or issues you would like us to cover in future episodes. You can keep up to date with us and the podcast by following us at Glad You Knew on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Links are in the description below.